Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give people just 2 more minutes to join, and then we'll kick off today's program. Welcome to those of us that are joining right now. We'll begin in 2 minutes, just to give people enough time to log in. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll begin in 1 more minute, just to give people enough time to join in. Welcome to those of us that are joining right now. We will begin shortly. Well, I'm so excited to welcome all of you to our program today. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, who will then introduce our distinguished speaker. So Menachir Daraj is a professor of political science at TCU. He earned his doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Daraj has also given numerous interviews on global and Middle Eastern affairs to international and national media, among them Associated Press, United Press International, the New York Times, Public Broadcasting Service, Television, and the National Public Radio and The Economist. Dr. Daraj is also an associate at the Tower Center. So Dr. Daraj, we welcome you, and I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Bora, for that kind introduction. And thank you for all the wonderful work that you do to organize this series. You're not so invisible hand behind the success of this lecture series. So I want to acknowledge that publicly. Today, we are fortunate to have one of the foremost and keen observers of Middle East scene in general, and the Persian Gulf states, Arab states of Persian Gulf in particular in the Middle East, Robert Mason, and I'm delighted that he accepted our invitation to join us today. Dr. Mason is a non-resident fellow at Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, D.C., but he had done stints in other places, including American University in Cairo in Egypt. His articles have appeared in Middle East Journal, Middle East Policy, British Journal of Middle East Studies, Third World Quarterly, European Foreign Affairs Review, and his research also is included in Financial Times, National Interest, The Hill, Rusi News Brief, Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, The National, The Diplomat, New Turkey, Iran Review, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, which is a very top-notch journal in Middle East, and in Open Democracy, among many other outlets. So I'm delighted that he'll be sharing his ideas with us on a very timely subject, the war in Ukraine and its geopolitical impact in the Middle East that we see unfold. And Dr. Mason is going to give a presentation for about between 20 minutes to a half hour. After that, I have a few questions to ask him myself, but you, the audience, are most welcome to put your questions either in Q&A or in chat, or just use the raise hand function to ask your questions directly. And I'm going to allow at least 20 minutes to 15 minutes for your question. So take it away, Dr. Mason.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Menachir, for the introduction. And thank you to your center for this invitation to speak today on the war in Ukraine and its impact, particularly on the Middle East. Great to be with you. So I thought I would just make some remarks, broad remarks on the overview of the situation in Ukraine, NATO strategy, followed by particular concerns and policy issues in the Middle East and North Africa region, followed by some conclusions, which at this time, given the conflict is ongoing, are sort of conclusions just at this point in time, and certainly can't be construed as the concluding part of the end of the conflict. So let's just see how we go on with these points. The overview of the situation is that Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th of February 2022, what was known as a special operation to demilitarize and denazify, or even erase Ukraine as a state, which has been primarily led by a disinformation campaign as part of the overall strategy of the Kremlin. It's been a selective in its use of softstalgia, which is Soviet nostalgia, which has been very apt and applicable to President Putin's grip on power. It's been a key part of his leadership since he assumed the presidency. The partial mobilization announced in September 2022 has been particularly poorly conceived, particularly for Russians in general, as they seek to escape from this call up and move away from being dragged into this conflict. Well, what is important also is to note is that Russia's economy is rather small at the moment, constrained both by sanctions and with a particular dependency on energy exports. The war in Russia's war, follows its annexation of Crimea in 2014, which really should have been the wake-up call for NATO member states in responding more robustly, perhaps, to the situation that it's now facing. There are, of course, historical issues which I'm not going to get into in this presentation about Russia's claims over Ukraine and what it's trying to achieve there, but certainly over the last few years in particular, President Putin has taken on a new approach, more robust approach to enhance his credibility, enhance his political power and status by pursuing these militaristic objectives. So what it is in specifically is an invasion which was unprovoked. It's responding to NATO expansion over the past few years, and certainly there's a discussion to be had on how that has been managed, and the kind of language which is being used in terms of the accession of new member states, and the timeline which that was supposed to follow, and whether it is supposed to be in the short term, states like Ukraine, in fact, applying for NATO membership, or whether it's going to be a long-term indefinite posture. It's been territorial expansion for sure, but one which has been met with robust international engagement. I'll move on to the maps in just a second to see where we're at in terms of annexation and the current situation, although it's changing obviously very rapidly. The warfare itself is unusual in that it's hybrid warfare, so it's clearly had an impact on international energy markets. There's food security concerns, which I'll speak of directly with reference to the Middle East and North African region in just a moment. There's nuclear safety concerns and the information war, of course, corresponding with that. It's caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, 7.3 million Ukrainians displaced, a third of the population. And this idea that the NATO transatlantic community has been challenged, it was talking about never again after 1945 would we see such holocausts and genocides taking place. Clearly that's been breached in 1995, in particular with the Srebrenica massacre. But there's indications and recurring indications that these kinds of massacres are occurring in Ukraine as well. And the numbers are there to support that. Ukraine war marks really the end of the post-Cold War period. So this relative stability, the relative balance of power we've had with the US in a unilateral position, it's been fundamentally challenged by Russia not as an emerging power, but as a declining power, and being able to pursue its objectives, its narrow objectives, in a very aggressive way. So on the maps, we can just get a sense of what's taking place, because this is obviously a very fluid situation. But what we've ended up with most recently is the annexation of Russia, Russian annexation of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, as well as its already existing control over Crimea. And that was really in the lead up to President Putin's birthday. Immediate impacts have been 28,000 killed as of September this year, concerns over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants and how it was used in the conflict. The Ukraine being armed by Western states, able to push back Russian forces, poorly trained, as evidently they have been, and poorly organized. And so, quite surprisingly, Ukraine has been effective in building momentum, which is ongoing over the last few days, weeks, and increasingly active in its deployments. The EU is being unprecedented in its sanctions against Russia, but also having to pivot, if you like, towards new forms of energy, new energy relationships, in order to plug the gap of Russian energy exports, which have fundamentally been compromised. That's a situation particularly for Germany, which is facing a foreign policy which has had to do a complete U-turn away from engagement with Russia into one which seeks to counter Russia and take a stand. And it's been particularly showing solidarity with countries such as France, sharing energy resources and building up alternative supply chains. As of June 2022, we have Finland and Sweden in particular pushing for NATO membership, seeing the writing on the wall, seeing this as not only a conflict which affects Ukraine, but also one which challenges their national security strategies. And they're waiting right now for ratification by the NATO member states to achieve full membership. The conflict in particular has shown great unity between EU member states and NATO member states, and surprisingly so. I think President Putin's done a great job in pushing a lot of states which didn't see eye to eye together. Clearly, there's still differences which exist, especially with certain states such as Hungary, for example, which takes a much more pro-Russian perspective on things than other EU member states. And the idea that Zelensky has become a wartime hero really challenged on a personal level these kinds of discourses which were showing Russia to be the stronger actor. So what is the strategy for Europe and beyond right now? Well, as I've mentioned, post-1945, we've had enlargement of democracy towards the Eastern European states in Central Europe, and this idea that there would never be this kind of conflict again. But there's more recently been a confusion about goals. So from 2007 and 8, there was the point that NATO agreed with Georgia and Ukraine that these would become NATO member states sometime in the future. This kind of lack of clarity, which may be the crux of the problems which we're currently facing. The EU enlargement policy towards the eastern states in 2009 was to consolidate and support democracy. But now, what is the strategy? Well, there certainly needs to be more focus on democracy in states such as Hungary and Poland, which has been eroded by populist leaders. Perhaps a move away from the global war on terror. We've had that for a decade, and focusing more on other emerging adversaries, such as Russia in this case. And President Macron of France talking most recently about a new contract between the global North and global South states. And here, this includes members of the Middle East. So more cooperation in areas which are strategic to both sets of states, whether it's climate change, health, education, or poverty. Excuse me. So the concerns at the regional and international level are really perhaps on nuclear proliferation and the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in particular in Ukraine, as Russia seeks to regain the ground, regain control over the situation as Ukrainian forces march on. Post-COVID economic recovery has been impacted by the fallout from this conflict in particular. The energy crisis, food security, food prices alone have risen by 50%, shipping by 23%. This has had a disproportionate effect on the poorer states, such as those in the Middle East, the non-energy exporters in particular. And the inflation and the eroding impact that has on trade against the stronger US dollar. So it's another economic shock, one which can ill be afforded in the West, but certainly having a disproportionate impact on those states which lack the development capacity of NATO member states. So social unrest being another possibility a decade after the Arab uprisings. Which countries are most affected? Well, in terms of food security, the list includes Egypt, Lebanon, Sudan, Tunisia, Turkey, and the Emirates. Although the Emirates, of course, is cash rich, benefiting from higher energy prices. And so, again, looking at those non-energy exporters or those with lower energy capabilities. And we've seen the foreign minister Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, seeking to calm these states by touring them and discussing strategies for those most affected. There has been some movement on the diplomatic front to address this issue. The most vulnerable countries, though, not only span Middle East, but also Africa more broadly, including Somalia, Benin, and Laos, for example. And when we look at food inflationary prices, it's obviously an issue globally, with different countries taking different measures to address it. So looking through the lens of MENA states, well, different Middle East countries have responded to the Ukrainian conflict in different ways, in quite predictable ways, in fact. So we have Syria, for example, taking a firmly Russian view, recognizing Donetsk and Luhansk, for example. That's because Russia's heavily involved in the Syria conflict, has been for some time now. And these are the allied states. There's other countries which are traditionally more aligned with the US, but have also, particularly because of energy gains and lack of confidence in the US over the recent years, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, as we've seen in the news, taken a much more balanced approach than they may have otherwise done, because they've been generating more defensive relationships with Russia. They have energy concerns and interests, we've seen with the OPEC Plus oil agreement. And so this is a somewhat grey area in how they've developed this critical moment, much more closer ties to Russia, and the US has been quite keen to not necessarily break those ties, but certainly weaken them at this strategic moment. And the UAE has been in a somewhat similar position, particularly as they've been refocusing their attention on joint ventures with Russia in the area of the Checkmate stealth fighter, rather than necessarily follow the F-35 deal, the F-35 US fighter, because the conditions of that has been the US asking the UAE to pull back on cooperation with China in the telecom sector with companies such as UA, and it's not willing to take such drastic measures. And so it's very interesting to see how this plays out. Iran is another anti-Western state. They're obviously initially taking a balanced view, but being much more involved in drone sales and supporting those drone sales to Russia with manpower. Hezbollah blaming the US for starting the conflict. This is not a surprise to see these kinds of state and non-state actors taking this kind of perspective. Turkey has been in an interesting position because it's taken a more balanced role as not only a NATO member state, but also one which has concerns about terrorism, about various groups operating in Sweden and Finland, and is able to leverage that in their negotiations for NATO accession. And then UAE, coming back to the UAE, appearing on the Financial Action Task Force grey list because of the number of Russians coming into the country, and the concern of money laundering, which follows that. Algeria and Qatar are in an interesting situation because they're both energy exporters of significant quantities of gas. And Algeria, particularly for southern European states, has potential pipeline access. Qatar is on longer term contracts, exports a lot to Asia at the moment, could potentially come in later on as an important actor, already supplies a lot of gas to the UK. But these states, although part of the solution, not singly part of the solution, that we really have to take a much more broader perspective on who's involved and what other measures are needed to break these energy ties to Russia. And so what are the conclusions from this kind of conflict? Well, there's a number of points, both from sort of an international relations perspective, but also from an empirical perspective on food, on energy, and on norms. Russia wants to avoid antagonizing the MENA states. As I mentioned, it's already sent Sergei Lavrov with messages of support and the fact that food will not be overly disrupted from the conflict. And indeed, grain exports have resumed, not necessarily in the quantities hoped for, but certainly moving in that direction. The cost of living crisis continues in Europe. Certainly the impact continues beyond Europe in terms of the energy impact. And the recent OPEC Plus deal doesn't really support any resolution or any lowering of the oil price. So it doesn't seem to be any impact on the positive side at the moment. But certainly the potential for a different deal in December might follow, depending on diplomacy up to that point. There is an opportunity for the energy sectors in certain MENA states to work in more cooperation. There's certainly potential after the joint cooperation, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, on bringing more oil onto the market. That would certainly have an impact. But again, it's only parts and parcel of the deal, and it raises other questions, raises other anxieties, plays into regional security issues in the Gulf more broadly. What about annexation? Is this a new normal? Certainly the Western states have been very, very strong in pushing back against this Russian intervention, precisely to avoid the kind of precedent which could persist, and it could affect Middle East states going forward. This land grab, this tactical intervention, and so on. Certainly there's already tensions which exist, and this could simply exacerbate those kinds of tensions. Unfortunately for NATO, there's already questions raised about responsibility to protect, about the global war on terror, about the failed two-state solution. This is just another area which creates uncertainty, apprehension about Western foreign policy and normative values. There's also questions about historic empire, about political neutrality, which are the vital interests that states such as the US and its NATO allies are willing to protect the most and go after and secure and put pressure to bear. What kind of new world order are we seeking to achieve? How is there going to be an engagement with Russia and China on issues such as Ukraine and Taiwan, and how is that going to affect how we treat them as in other spheres, for example, in technology? And is there going to be a greater caution over Russian activities in the MENA region? Already its focus has been brought back to its neighborhood, but over time it may resume activities through Wagner Group, for example, through military force, through deals, port deals in particular, in places such as Sudan, which raise further questions from a MENA perspective. And about authoritarianism in particular being inherently unstable. This has particular resonance for the Middle East, especially after the Arab uprisings, and how transition, evolution, political economy can be improved, secured, enhanced in a way which is more stable going forward. It's interesting to see what happens with Zelensky and Putin at the G20 and whether they will meet, whether there'll be some kind of Turkish mediation, and any ways that this conflict can be, first of all, de-escalated and then brought to a final conclusion. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. You gave us a lot of food for thoughts, and I will ask a couple of questions, and I see some of our audience have their own questions, and I will go to them in a few minutes. But let me ask to share your thoughts with us on this recent hypothesis that I read in a piece, that Russian invasion of Ukraine has polarized the world in this sense, that surely NATO and US have come to closer alliance, as you also mentioned in your presentation. Several countries that were not a member of NATO, Sweden, Finland, and now Ukraine, Moldova, they would like, and Georgia, they would like to join NATO. So it really has expanded and strengthened NATO. And the US did not send as much natural gas to Europe as it did prior to Russian invasion of Ukraine. So economic and military ties has solidified, and US and Europe also declared a joint economic initiative worth $600 billion to sort of counterpose China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. And these are all new development that tells us that the Western camp has become more solidified in their alliances in the aftermath of Russian invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, we see a development in which countries like China, India, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and to some extent even Saudi Arabia and UAE have come in closer interaction with Russia. And are we seeing an Asian, in this sense, an Asian alliance also taking shape in this polarized world? So that's the first question that I want to get your thoughts on.
Thanks very much. Well, I mean, certainly there's been a lot of speculation in the media recently about this sort of emerging Asian alliance. What I would say is, I think it's a highly complex dynamic, because apart from at the regional level, Central Asia, Eurasia region, there's also dynamics within these states. So if we take Turkey, for example, you know, economic crisis, Russia's already engaged in a conflict, and it's destabilized, has domestic issues from that. Iran is going through a period of turmoil as well. This is not conducive to a stable and sort of long-term, well-thought-through alliance. Every nation state makes decisions, foreign policy decisions, based on its best interests. And these interests, whilst they may converge in some periods of time when it suits them, it doesn't necessarily converge all the time and to a great degree. So some of these relationships are strategic, perhaps. Some of them are tactical, and some of them I think are temporary. And so I think it's probably too soon to assume that these kinds of states are, first of all, allied. And second of all, if they are allied in the short term, whether that can be sustainable, because I certainly think comparing this group to the NATO members, which have had a longer, decades-long alliance based on their shared national security interests, and increasingly based on other areas as well, such as energy security and so on, as well as the common threat perception. Whether that really is a comparable situation. So I think it's an interesting one to watch, and there are certain states which are cooperating more. But when it comes to the Middle East in particular, I mean, going back to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, although their energy interests in the short term are aligned with those of Russia, perhaps in terms of attracting the highest or sustainably high price while they diversify, showing exasperation perhaps with certain US policies, and certainly not willing to be pushed around anymore, if you like, as small states and regional partners. And have certainly got various contentions across media, socially, economic, and on security issues as well, are unlikely to move into a new orbit. Their core interests are still best served as they diversify, not necessarily in focusing wholly on energy issues, but also looking more broadly at allies which can sustain them over the longer term, and that includes on security issues, in which Western states, particularly the US, has been well adapted.
Yes, and my second question is very related to the first one, and that's what you just ended on. Many observers did not expect countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia that need United States as their security umbrella, and they have extensive security ties, trade ties with United States, to cozy up to Putin at the time of his need and give their blessing to OPEC Plus, a recent agreement to cut the oil production by 2 million barrels a day starting November 1st. And also the way that they have tried to do a balancing act between their relation with the West and US on the one hand, and also the relation with Russia and China has taken some by surprise. But also the exploring countries like Qatar. I know that major German companies, energy companies, are trying to sign a long-term contract with Qatar to supply them with liquefied natural gas. Is it going to be 15 years, 20 years? And as you mentioned, Qatar has long-term contract to provide Asia with their natural gas, but they have said that they're willing to expand their production capacity and terminals to be the source for Germany and other European countries if they so desired. And then Olaf Scholz had visited recently Doha and then visited Abu Dhabi to explore possible expansion of energy ties with the countries too. And you mentioned possibility that Iran or Algeria may loom larger as alternative to Russian oil. My gathering is that as long as Putin is around, at least, and he shows no sign of wanting to give up power, and he's still not an old man, so to speak, the West has decided that they want to win themselves off dependence on Russian oil and gas, and they want to multiply their sources of energy security. What impact do you think this will have in configuration of political relationship going just beyond energy?
Well, first of all, I think the OPEC Plus decision was, I mean, the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a statement after that, given the uproar it's created in the US, saying it was done for purely economic reasons. And I think that was the mistake that was made, that it wasn't accounting for the wider variety of inputs into foreign policy, which needed to be factored into the decision in this case, namely bringing global energy markets under control and making sure that the energy prices comes into a much more comfortable range, not only for the producers but also for the consuming states. So that might give some cause for optimism in the next OPEC Plus meeting. But given that that's in conjunction with Russia, and given it's precisely the flip side of the coin in terms of Russian interests, and making sure that it maintains a higher price for its energy exports, that's a difficult round peg to get into a square hole. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. Certainly ammonia, green hydrogen, this kind of thing is taking off, and there's much more activity, and I think welcome activity, not only with Qatar but other Gulf states in this direction. Whether it's going to shift geoeconomic power and how it's going to do so, I think we have to watch this space, because it's really the first exports have started now. The motion is in effect, but it's still too soon to see how this can be ramped up and which states are going to be building on this over the coming years. There's certainly an interest and an effort in this direction to move quite quickly, but I think it still hinges on the shape and form of the conflict, its impact on energy markets and demand in these Western states.
Thank you. We have a number of good questions from our audience, and I would read them, and we can, go over them one by one. The first question from Raymond Termini is: Turkey is straddling the fence with respect to Russia and the West with respect to Ukraine. How long do you think it will be able to continue to do this?
Well, I think it will attempt to do this over as long as it takes, in effect. So Turkey's in an interesting situation that it has a working relationship with Russia, and certainly a working relationship with the West as well. It's trying to mediate. It's not been successful so far, and I think it hinges on a number of factors. Certainly there's other states, I mean, Saudi Arabia is one of them, trying to mediate in the conflict and has links to President Putin directly. But I think it's going to have to push as much as it can to try to achieve some kind of response, and certainly it's in its interest to do that for the benefits, both its own economic benefits in terms of energy and security, but also what it can gain in terms of prestige and status by doing so. But I think the fundamental question is that achievable? And certainly there's no indication at the moment that Russia is in a position to listen and to heed such advice.
Thank you for that. The answer to your question, Margie Mays, that if this is going to be recorded and be available again, the answer is yes. So I'll go to the next question, which is from Yuri Ichenko. Why the U.S. closest ally in the Middle East, Israel, doesn't show support for Ukraine beyond humanitarian efforts?
Well, Israel and Russia have their own relations going on at the same time. I think Israel has been diplomatic in this situation and moved to express some solidarity, as the question alludes to. I think it's a difficult one for for any state which is trying to engage with Russia to come in and show support either way. The key issue here, I think, is energy, and it's been far more important for the US to work with its Gulf allies to achieve some kind of impact than it has been to work directly with Israel on this issue. We've seen that with President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates recently, which did not produce the kind of effect that I think he was hoping to achieve. But certainly, I think states don't necessarily have to be involved in what could be a lose-lose situation.
Thank you for that response. Tim McCarthy, if the result of the war in Ukraine is something that reads as a clear loss for Russia and entails substantial weakening of Russia as a security partner and military supplier, what would be the implication for the MENA region and particularly for leading powers in the region?
Well, at the moment, that's a very hypothetical question, because I think Russia's playing a long game in Ukraine, and certainly there's still tools at its disposal to achieve a tipping balance of power, whether it's the employment of tactical nuclear warheads, or as we've seen, this first of all, this redeployment, broader deployment into Ukraine. If Russia was to lose this conflict, and I think it would be a highly dramatic loss in terms of President Putin and Russia's image abroad, which really raises the stakes and makes such a loss, quite catastrophic in the MENA region. At play, I think we would see something very similar to the withdrawal, the Western withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a loss of confidence in terms of security and a loss of confidence in decision making at that time. This will probably be less impactful because Russia has more limited partnerships in the MENA region. So for Syria, it wouldn't necessarily change anything. For Iran, it wouldn't necessarily change anything. For those states which have been looking and probably thought initially in the early stages that Russia would dominate and come to achieve its aims in quick succession in Ukraine, they've been sorely disappointed. So for some states, they've both been surprised and perhaps not disappointed, but certainly awakened to the fact that this is not Russian forces at their best posture. They haven't been able to achieve their objectives. However, Russia still has other cards up its sleeve. It's still an important energy exporter. It's still an important actor within OPEC Plus. It's still an important security provider in terms of some military hardware. And it still has an ability to achieve some military aims through groups such as Wagner, which is a sort of aligned military outfit, commercial military outfit. So, even if it loses in Ukraine, you have to look at specific bilateral relationships, I think, to see how the outcome will impact specifically in each case.
Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Cotton, and he asks, what is the likelihood that Putin will attempt a small tactical use of nuclear weapon to send a message to NATO that it is time to negotiate a deal on Ukraine? And if he did, would the Russian military go along with it, or would they see it as putting Mother Russia at risk and move to depose Putin? Can Putin risk making Russia an international pariah by using nuclear weapons?
Well, I think Russia's already an international pariah state. moving in that direction, I think I can only, I mean, I'm not a nuclear analyst, but I would say that what the intelligence services have been saying most recently is that rhetoric was designed to give Western states pause for thought. But there's been no evidence that President Putin's been moving in that direction. It would certainly be a game changer. It would certainly lead to a huge response from Western states, I think, and further unite what has already been a united conflict. Would there be some kind of domestic backlash? It is very difficult to tell. There's certainly been a change of military leadership in Russia as the conflict has progressed. I think President Putin is surrounding himself with loyalists, so I think the potential for a significant backlash has been predicted and dealt with as far as he imagines it could be. Would it lead to a negotiation with Russia? Well, I think that's been on the cards for a long time now, and the question is what kind of pathway would lead to it. I would say that the tactical use of nuclear weapons would push Russia in the opposite direction, and if it was trying to achieve any kind of negotiation, that would not be the way to achieve it.
Thank you for that. Greg Kosick asked, has the war in Ukraine affected U.S. peacemaking efforts in the Middle East pursued through the Abraham Accords?
Not to my mind. I mean, I'm looking at the Abraham Accords right now, and I can't see that it would have a tangible impact per se. Certainly, U.S. efforts. It's interesting. He's noted U.S. peacemaking efforts in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. You know, I think that would have to be unpacked slightly. But no, I think Abraham Accords has been on point for some time now. Certainly, the conflict plays into contentions and concerns that different states have about U.S. interests and U.S. pressure and U.S. policy during the conflict, particularly on energy. Which we've mentioned in terms of President Biden's visit, in terms of what was hoped for from the OPEC Plus meeting. But I don't think that the conflict has particular bearing on what predated the Ukraine conflict and this broader interest in the Middle East in terms of the Abraham Accords, which is drawing Israel and certain Middle East states closer, particularly concerning Iran.
Wonderful. Tatiana Androsov has a question that mainly deals with the role of gender configuration in this conflict. And she asks, an interesting observation, the US and Europe have a higher percentage of women than men. Russia, China, India, and Saudi Arabia all have more men than women. This is especially true in the lower age brackets. For instance, in Russia, in the age group 20 to 24, you have about 960 women for 1,000 men. Have you ever considered that this might have an effect on the way these states behave? By the way, the Ukraine has more women than men, thus mirroring the Western trend.
Well, it's an interesting point. There's a whole literature on gender in international relations and the kind of decision making and an effect that can be achieved through that. Certainly, there's a point about masculinity, perhaps, which could be considered in this case, and it'd be interesting to read a thesis on that. But yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to disentangle demographic trends from current affairs, and it's certainly a point which can be considered in terms of policy. I don't think that. I mean, I know Russia has a demographic issue, but you know, there's other points which I think supersede it in terms of how its outlook, in terms of its near abroad and how it pursues its imperialist policy. I think that's important to look back in history and see how Russia's behaved and consider population within that.
Thank you. Raymond Termini has a second question, and he asks, what sanctions are being imposed on Russia, on Russian oil and gas, that is? Who's imposing them? Are they working? Is the US imposing secondary sanctions?
Well, you know, the specifics of sanctions is a changeable point. Certainly, there's specific Russian state-owned Russian oil and gas companies. Certainly, there's high-profile Russian individuals which are being targeted unilaterally and through broader measures. So that includes, you know, many of the NATO members, if not all of them. Are they working? Well, that's to be dealt with, really. It's to be considered. I think at the moment, you know, sanctions is a blunt instrument, and there's a whole literature on this in terms of how sanctions have been employed in Iraq, and how they're employed against Iran, and how they're now being employed in terms of Russia. They're doing a job. They're certainly constraining Russian behavior in terms of how much funding it's able to channel them back into its military assets. It's sending an important signal. As I mentioned, it's a signal of unity and of alliance and political will, which I think is hugely important at this point in the conflict, when we consider escalations, as has been the case in the past and could be the case in the future. It's not going to be won on sanctions. You know, the OPEC plus decision, which raises the amount of money which Russia can gain through higher energy exports, can help offset some of these sanctions. So obviously diplomacy and other measures need to be brought to bear simultaneously, and it's those kinds of measures, the creative diplomacy, the back channel diplomacy, which is most likely to succeed in cases such as this. Russia's certainly on a channel, on a pathway to conflict. What are the off-ramps going to be? Sanctions may be part of the political calculation, but I think mediation attempts, as I say, back channel attempts, are going to be far more effective.
Thank you for that response. Alexandra Powell asks, how do you see US policy toward Iran evolving as Iran increases wartime support of Russia and undergoes its own internal turmoil?
Well, I think Russia has been, I think the US has been focused on Iran, as have the other permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And that's unlikely to change in the near term. All the efforts have been on dealing with the remaining issues in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and the kinds of issues which are outstanding, such as whether the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is going to be sanctioned or not, and whether it's going to be considered as a legal or illegal entity, are some of the key points. This is really going to come down to political will, and I don't think the Ukraine conflict is going to impinge on that too much. What is going to impinge more is the stability of Iran going forward in the next few weeks and months, and these kind of protests which we're seeing on the streets right now, and the kind of response that is engendered, and whether Western powers are looking to consider that as part of their decision making, or whether they're willing to ignore these kinds of points as they try to achieve an agreement. I think at the moment, momentum is there. There's still key final issues to be concluded, but you know, we're in the final leg of what could bring Iran back into a nuclear agreement with the US. So if that can be achieved, that will be something. It certainly won't be everything, and there's still outstanding issues. I've mentioned the drone exports, and that's particularly sensitive in terms of its relationship with Russia. There's also developing missile capabilities. There's the development of the Iranian nuclear program as it's progressed during these negotiations. And there's these human rights issues, as I've mentioned, in terms of the protests as well. So there's a lot going on, but if there isn't a new nuclear agreement, then that can create further difficulties, which may see a hardening of US pressure, may cause further thought about how pressure can be brought to bear on Iran. But don't forget that under the President Trump's administration, we had maximum pressure policy, which was ineffective at changing Iranian behavior. So it's unlikely that moving down towards that route will be effective in itself. In fact, I did my PhD on the fact that this kind of pressure was counterproductive, and it was actually more about engagement in the kind of way that we've seen with the JCPOA. It'd be far more effective. So I think that is the way to go, and whether it's going to change Iran's behavior in terms of other states, it could certainly, if there's a new nuclear deal, it would certainly change Iranian behavior with Russia and China, because they've benefited immensely from Iran's isolation. And so that, although there wouldn't be necessarily a rapprochement per se, there would certainly be a recalculation, recalibration of Iranian foreign policy behavior as it seeks to export more energy supplies, and then it could potentially move on to dealing with other political and security issues.
Thank you for that. We have 2 remaining questions and 4 minutes left. So the next question with John covered, do you think that NATO can thrive with autocratic leaders in its membership, such as Hungary, Turkey, Poland, which is heading that way?
Short answer is not really, no. And that's what I mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation. That actually the core mission now of NATO and the EU is to address populism in Europe. We've just got a far right leader in Italy now. France almost went far right in its latest election. So this is something to keep an eye on. It would certainly create a disunity, a lack of harmonization between the states in the EU. And it's precisely that kind of political stability which is absolutely key in achieving the kind of strategies which are necessary in not only maintaining European security and unity and transatlantic security and unity, but also rolling that out on a broader level and basis in order to address global threats which are coming into view.
Wonderful. The last question comes from Tarek Rajaf, and Tarek asks, there's actually a tri-state Iran, Turkey, Algeria alliance that is not given proper relevance. Why is that?
I think that would require further discussion. Iran, Turkey, Algeria, certainly there's perhaps overlapping interests there, but that's not the ball game.
Okay. One last question. Tatiana Andrasov says, does Russia hold an advantage because its leaders, especially Putin and Lavrov, have been in power for over 2 decades? People tend to forget that Lavrov knows the US rather well, having been the Russian rep to UN headquarters.
Yeah, I think this is an important point about autocracies and democracies, and certainly it's one which has been raised recently about Iran and how it's willing to engage with the US. You know, one of the key sticking points is the fact that you know, if there's another election and President Trump or another Republican, somebody else comes into power as president, it decides to roll back again the JCPOA, as was done in 2018 under President Trump. So there is certainly an issue about consistency, about promises made and commitments undertaken, and how that is transferred and interpreted from one administration to another in the US, but it's also true of other democracies in Europe as well, and worldwide. There is an autocratic historic memory, which is incredibly useful at delivering a longer term strategy and development objectives. I think the secret is to focus on what democracies do best: their resilience, their joined up government thinking and delivery, and really relying on leaderships to follow through on areas of foreign policy which have been undertaken in the past in the best national interest, but also to not play politics with fundamental treaties and agreements which have been undertaken in the best interest of those countries, and not to pursue party politics in those cases.
Thank you so much for those comprehensive and thoughtful answers. And thank you to our audience for asking very good questions. And thank you all for your engagement and for your indulgence. This has been a wonderfully, I think, very, very productive session that we have had, full of questions and wonderful answers. I especially want to thank Dr. Robert Mason for taking time of his busy schedule and sharing some of his thoughts and insight on a very timely subject with us today. And I say good day to all of you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I hope we can stay in touch. And it was a pleasure to meet you and hear your very thoughtful insights.
Great to chat. Be in touch.
And as you can see, you generated a great deal of interest on the part of our audience and quite a few questions. And everybody says thank you in their Q&A too.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Nice Hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
sir.
Thanks, everyone.